The dust swirled around Jake Morrison's boots as he rode into the small trading post near the Arizona border. It was 1887 and the summer heat made everything shimmer like a mirage. His horse Thunder was tired from the long journey across the desert, and Jake's water was running low. He had been tracking a group of cattle rustlers for 3 weeks, following their trail through canyons and across dry riverbeds. Jake was a seasoned cowboy, weathered by years under the harsh sun. His face was lined with experience and his hands were calloused from rope work and handling difficult horses. He worked for the Double R Ranch, one of the largest spreads in the territory, and his reputation for finding stolen cattle was well known throughout the region. As he dismounted near the trading post, Jake noticed something unusual. There were fresh tracks in the dirt, but they weren't from horses or cattle. These were moccasin prints, light and careful, the kind made by Apache feet. His hand instinctively moved closer to his gun. Relations between the settlers and the Apache had been tense for years, though some tribes had made peace with the government. The trading post was a simple wooden building with a covered porch. Jake tied Thunder to the hitching post and walked up the creaky steps. The owner, an old Mexican man named Carlos, greeted him with a nod. Carlos had run this post for 20 years and had seen everything the frontier could offer. "Water for my horse and myself," Jake said, placing coins on the counter. "And information if you have it. I'm tracking rustlers who took 40 head from the Double R." Carlos filled a bucket for Thunder and handed Jake a cool cup of water from the well. "See, I saw them. 3 men, maybe 4 days ago. They drove the cattle north toward the mountains. But, senor, you should know something else. There are Apache in the area, a small band, maybe 8 or 10. They have been peaceful, but—" Jake nodded. He had dealt with Apache before. Some were hostile. Others were just trying to survive as their traditional way of life disappeared. The key was reading the situation correctly and not making assumptions. As Jake stepped back onto the porch, he saw her. An Apache woman sat in the shade of a large cottonwood tree about 50 yards away. She was middle-aged, wearing traditional dress decorated with intricate beadwork. Her long black hair was braided with strips of leather and small silver ornaments. She sat perfectly still, watching him with dark, intelligent eyes. Jake had learned over the years that Apache women were often the wisdom keepers of their people. They possessed knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death in this harsh land. He approached slowly, his hands visible and empty, showing respect. The woman spoke first in clear English with only a slight accent. "You are the cowboy who follows the thieves." It wasn't a question. Jake nodded. "Yes, ma'am. They took cattle from my ranch. I mean to get them back." She studied him for a long moment, as if measuring his character. "The men you seek are dangerous. They have killed before. They camp now in Devil's Canyon, 2 days' ride north. But that is not why I waited for you." Jake felt a chill despite the heat. "Ma'am?" The Apache woman stood gracefully. She was smaller than Jake had first thought, but there was a strength about her that commanded respect. "There is a boy with them. A child, maybe 10 summers. They took him from a wagon train 2 weeks past." Jake's blood ran cold. Child kidnapping was one of the worst crimes on the frontier. Is the boy alive?" "Yes, but not for long. These men, they plan to sell him to slavers in Mexico. They think he is Apache, but he is not. He is white, with hair like corn silk and eyes like the sky. They took him because he was small and could not fight." The woman reached into a small leather pouch and pulled out something that made Jake's heart stop. It was a small wooden toy horse carved with intricate detail, the kind a loving father might make for his son. This fell from their wagon as they passed. The boy dropped it, hoping someone would find it and know he had been there. Jake took the toy with trembling hands. He had seen hundreds of such toys in his life, but something about this one seemed familiar. The craftsmanship was excellent, with tiny details carved into the mane and tail. Someone had spent hours making this with love. "Why are you telling me this?" Jake asked. "Your people and mine haven't always been friends." The Apache woman's expression softened slightly. "Because some things are more important than the color of skin or the language we speak. A child taken from his family is wrong, no matter who does the taking. And because—" She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Because you have honest eyes. I have watched you. You water your horse before yourself. You paid the old man fairly for water that cost him little. These small things tell me about your heart." Jake looked at the toy horse again. "Do you know anything else about the boy? Where he came from?" The wagon train was heading to California. Farmers, I think. The attack happened at Willow Creek near the old mission ruins. The boy's family, she shook her head sadly. They did not survive. Only the boy was taken alive. The weight of responsibility settled on Jake's shoulders like a heavy blanket. He had been tracking cattle thieves, which was his job. Now he was faced with something much more serious. A child's life hung in the balance, and time was running out. These men you described, they sound like the Garrett gang. Bill Garrett and his brothers. They've been wanted for robbery and murder in 3 territories. The Apache woman nodded. The leader has a scar across his left cheek like a claw mark. That confirmed it. Bill Garrett had been mauled by a bear years ago and carried the scars. Jake had seen his wanted poster many times. The reward was substantial, but that wasn't what motivated Jake now. Somewhere in Devil's Canyon, a terrified little boy was counting on someone to save him. Ma'am, I don't even know your name, but I'm grateful for this information. I'll do everything I can to get that boy back safely. The woman smiled for the first time, transforming her serious face. I'm called Maria by the white men. My Apache name is too difficult for your tongue. And Cowboy, there is something else you should know. Jake waited, sensing that whatever she was about to tell him was important. The boy, she said softly. He calls out in his sleep. Carlos heard him when they camped near here. He calls for his papa, but not in English. He speaks words in Apache. Jake frowned, confused. But you said he was white. Maria's eyes held a sadness that spoke of deep understanding. Yes, he is white, but he knows Apache words. This means something, Cowboy. Something important that you will understand when you see him. As she turned to leave, Maria looked back one more time. Be careful in Devil's Canyon. The spirits there are restless, and the Garrett brothers are like wolves. They will not give up the boy easily. Jake watched her walk away, moving silently through the desert scrub until she disappeared like a ghost. He looked down at the toy horse in his hand and made a silent promise. Whatever it took, he would bring that boy home. Jake spent the rest of the day preparing for what he knew would be the most dangerous mission of his life. He bought extra ammunition from Carlos along with dried beef, hardtack, and enough water for 3 days. The trading post owner also sold him a small bag of ground corn and some sugar. Provisions that might help keep a scared child calm if Jake could rescue him. As evening approached, Jake made camp near a small stream behind the trading post. He needed to think and plan carefully. The Garrett gang was known for their ruthlessness, and Devil's Canyon was treacherous terrain even without desperate criminals hiding there. The canyon had earned its name from the number of travelers who had disappeared in its twisting passages and hidden caves. While thunder grazed nearby, Jake studied the wooden toy horse by firelight. The craftsmanship was remarkable, with tiny details that showed genuine skill and patience. Someone had carved this with love, spending hours making it perfect for a child. Jake found himself wondering about the boy's family, cut down by outlaws who saw human life as worthless. The next morning, Jake rose before dawn and began the journey north toward Devil's Canyon. The landscape gradually changed from flat desert to rolling hills dotted with Joshua trees and sagebrush. By midday, the terrain became more rugged, with red rock formations rising like ancient monuments from the earth. As he rode, Jake thought about what Maria had told him. The boy knew Apache words, which was unusual for a white child traveling with a wagon train to California. Most settlers had little contact with Apache people, and few would have learned the language. This detail nagged at Jake's mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Late in the afternoon, Jake reached the entrance to Devil's Canyon. The narrow opening between towering red cliffs looked like the mouth of some enormous beast. The silence was complete except for the soft sound of thunder's hooves on sand and the whisper of wind through the rocks. Jake dismounted and studied the ground carefully. The tracks were easy to follow here. Multiple horses and cattle had passed through recently. He could see where the stolen cattle had been driven into the canyon, their hoofprints mixed with those of the outlaws' horses. But there was something else, smaller footprints that made Jake's heart clench with anger, a child's bare feet stumbling and struggling to keep up. Following the trail deeper into the canyon, Jake came upon the outlaws' first campsite. The ashes of their fire were 2 days old, and scattered around were the remains of their meal, coffee grounds, and several empty whiskey bottles. Jake noticed something that made his blood boil, a small depression in the sand where a child had slept, but no blanket or bedroll. They weren't even keeping the boy warm at night in the desert cold. As Jake examined the campsite more carefully, he found something that made him pause. Scratched into the sandy ground near where the boy had slept were symbols, crude drawings that looked like Apache pictographs. A horse, a man, and what appeared to be a house with smoke rising from it. The drawings were the work of a child, but they told a story that began to unlock the mystery Maria had hinted at. Jake carefully copied the symbols into his notebook, then continued following the trail. The canyon twisted and turned, creating a maze of passages that could easily confuse travelers. In several places, Jake had to dismount and lead Thunder through particularly narrow sections where the walls closed in on both sides. As the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls brilliant red and orange, Jake heard something that made him freeze. Voices carried on the desert wind. He quickly led Thunder behind a large boulder and climbed up the rocky slope to get a better view. Below him, in a wider section of the canyon, Jake could see the outlaws' camp. 4 men sat around a fire, drinking and playing cards. Their stolen cattle were penned in a natural corral formed by rock walls. And there, sitting alone against a large stone near the edge of the firelight, was a small figure that made Jake's hands clench into fists. The boy looked to be about 10 years old, just as Maria had said. His blonde hair was dirty and tangled, and his clothes were torn and stained. He sat with his knees drawn up to his chest, staring into the fire with the blank expression of someone who had seen too much horror for his young age. Jake studied the outlaws carefully. 3 of them matched the descriptions on wanted posters. Bill Garrett with his bare-scarred face, his younger brother Tom, who was known for his quick temper, and a half-breed named Snake Morrison, who was wanted for murder in Texas. The 4th man was a stranger, but his gun was worn low and tied down like a professional gunfighter. As Jake watched, one of the men, Tom Garrett, stood up and walked over to the boy. Jake's hand moved to his rifle, but he forced himself to wait and observe. Tom kicked sand at the child and said something that made the others laugh. The boy didn't react, just continued staring at the fire with that terrible blank expression. Then something unexpected happened. The boy spoke, and Jake could hear his words carried on the still air. But he wasn't speaking English. The child was speaking in Apache, the words soft and rhythmic like a prayer or a song. Tom Garrett cursed and raised his hand as if to strike the boy, but Bill Garrett called out sharply, "Leave him be, Tom. He's worth more undamaged. Those slavers in Sonora pay extra for healthy kids." Jake felt sick to his stomach, but he also felt a growing sense of urgency and purpose. He studied the camp layout, counting weapons and looking for the best approach. The outlaws had chosen their spot well, with clear sight lines in most directions and their backs against a solid rock wall. As full darkness fell, Jake made his way back to Thunder and led the horse farther up the canyon to a hidden spot where he could make a cold camp. He chewed on dried beef and hardtack, washing it down with water from his canteen while he planned his approach. The boy's use of Apache words was still puzzling Jake. He had encountered similar situations before during his years on the frontier. Sometimes white children were captured by Apache bands and raised as their own. When they were later rescued or traded back, they often spoke Apache fluently and had difficulty readjusting to white society. But this boy had been traveling with a wagon train, not living with Apache. Jake pulled out the wooden toy horse and examined it again by starlight. Something about the carving style seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it. The attention to detail suggested someone with considerable skill, perhaps a professional woodworker or someone who had learned the craft from a master. As he settled in for a few hours of rest before attempting the rescue, Jake heard something that made him sit up sharply. From somewhere deep in the canyon came the sound of drums, distant and rhythmic like a heartbeat. Apache drums, unless he was much mistaken. The sound sent a chill down Jake's spine. Were there Apache warriors in the area, perhaps planning their own attack on the outlaw camp? Or was it something else? Some spiritual ceremony taking place in the sacred spaces of the desert? Whatever the case, Jake knew his window of opportunity was narrow. He had to act soon, before the outlaws moved the boy to Mexico, and before whatever Apache presence was in the canyon decided to make itself known. The thought of that terrified child spending another night in captivity was unbearable. Jake checked his weapons one more time. His Colt, .45, a Winchester rifle, and a hunting knife his father had given him years ago. He also had a length of rope and the small bag of provisions he had bought for the boy. It wasn't much against 4 armed desperados. But Jake had faced worse odds before. As the drums continued their distant rhythm, Jake Morrison prepared to risk everything for a child he had never met. Guided by the words of an Apache woman and driven by a sense of justice that burned in his heart like the desert sun, Jake waited until well past midnight, when the outlaw camp had settled into the deep quiet that comes before dawn. The drums had stopped hours ago, leaving only the whisper of wind through the canyon and the distant call of a night bird. 3 of the outlaws were asleep around the dying fire, but Snake Morrison sat on guard duty, his rifle across his knees. Moving silently through the darkness, Jake worked his way down the rocky slope. Years of tracking cattle and hunting game had taught him how to move without making sound, placing each foot carefully and avoiding loose stones that might betray his presence. The moon was only a thin crescent, providing just enough light to navigate without being easily seen. From his position behind a large boulder, Jake could see the boy more clearly. The child was curled up on his side using his arms as a pillow. Even in sleep, his face showed the strain of his ordeal. Dried tear tracks were visible on his dirty cheeks, and he shivered occasionally in the cold desert air. Snake Morrison was alert, but not particularly vigilant. He spent more time drinking from a bottle than watching the darkness. Jake knew that guards often became less careful during the quiet hours before dawn, when fatigue made concentration difficult. This was his best chance. Jake began a wide circle around the camp, staying in the shadows and moving from rock to rock. His plan was simple but dangerous. Neutralize the guard quietly, wake the boy and get him away from the camp before the other outlaws realized what was happening. If shooting started, the narrow canyon would turn the sound into thunder, alerting every living thing for miles around. As Jake crept closer, he heard Snake Morrison muttering to himself, probably complaining about drawing guard duty. The half-breed was known for his bad temper and his habit of talking to himself when he drank. This tendency toward noise would help mask any small sounds Jake might make. Jake was within 20 feet of the guard when disaster nearly struck. A small stone loosened by his passage rolled down the slope and clinked against another rock. Snake Morrison's head snapped up and his hands tightened on his rifle. Jake froze, pressing himself against a boulder and controlling his breathing. For long seconds, Snake listened to the darkness. Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Finally, Snake relaxed and took another drink from his bottle, muttering about desert rats and settling stones. Jake waited another full minute before continuing his approach. When Jake was close enough to smell the whiskey on Snake's breath, he made his move. Rising silently from behind the guard, Jake pressed the barrel of his Colt against the back of Snake's neck while clamping his free hand over the man's mouth. "Don't move. Don't speak. Don't breathe hard," Jake whispered. "I'll put a bullet in your spine before you can blink." Snake Morrison was a killer, but he wasn't stupid. He could feel the gun barrel against his neck and knew that one sound would wake his companions and start a gunfight he might not survive. He nodded slightly to show he understood. Jake quickly relieved Snake of his weapons, tossing the rifle aside and pulling the man's pistol from its holster. Then, using a strip of leather from his gear, Jake bound Snake's hands behind his back and stuffed a bandana in his mouth as a gag. The whole process took less than 2 minutes. Now came the most dangerous part. Jake had to wake the boy and get him moving without alerting the sleeping outlaws. The child might cry out in fear, or he might be too frightened to understand that Jake was there to help him. Jake crept across the camp to where the boy lay sleeping. Up close, he could see more details that tugged at his heart. The child's feet were cut and swollen from being forced to walk without proper shoes. His clothes were the simple homespun fabric that frontier families made themselves, now torn and dirty from days of abuse. Jake knelt beside the boy and gently placed his hand over the child's mouth, ready to prevent any outcry. With his other hand, he shook the boy's shoulder softly. The child's eyes snapped open immediately, wide with terror. Jake could feel the boy's body tense to scream, but Jake's hand muffled any sound. Jake leaned close to the boy's ear and whispered as gently as he could, "Easy, son. I'm here to help you. I'm going to take you away from these bad men. Don't make any noise and everything will be all right." The boy's eyes, pale blue like winter sky, stared at Jake with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Jake slowly removed his hand from the boy's mouth, ready to clamp it back down if necessary. Instead, the child whispered something that nearly broke Jake's heart. "Are you my papa? I kept looking for my papa." The words were spoken in Apache, but Jake understood enough of the language from his years on the frontier to catch the meaning. He shook his head gently and whispered back in English, "No, son, but I'm going to take you somewhere safe. Can you be very quiet and come with me?" The boy nodded, his small face showing a maturity that no child should have to possess. Jake helped him sit up, noticing how thin the boy had become. His small hands were cold as ice, and he shivered constantly. Jake removed his own jacket and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. It was far too large, but it would provide warmth and some protection. Then, moving slowly and carefully, Jake lifted the child in his arms. The boy weighed almost nothing, another sign of how poorly he had been treated. As Jake began to carry the boy away from the camp, one of the sleeping outlaws stirred and mumbled something in his sleep. Jake froze, holding the child close and waiting to see if the man would wake fully. After what seemed like an eternity, the outlaw's breathing returned to the deep rhythm of sleep. Jake continued his careful retreat, carrying the boy toward the rocks where Thunder waited. Each step felt like it took forever, and Jake's muscles began to ache from the tension of moving so slowly and quietly. The boy remained silent, clinging to Jake's shirt with small fists. They had almost reached safety when the boy suddenly stiffened in Jake's arms and whispered urgently in Apache. Jake didn't understand all the words, but the tone was clearly a warning. The child was pointing back toward the camp with one small finger. Jake turned to look and saw that Snake Morrison had worked himself into a sitting position and was trying to make noise despite his gag. The half-breed had managed to knock over several metal cups with his feet, creating a clatter that was already causing the other outlaws to stir. "Time to run, son," Jake whispered to the boy and broke into a sprint toward Thunder. Behind them, Jake heard Bill Garrett's voice roar with anger as the outlaw leader discovered Snake tied up and the boy missing. "They're gone. Someone took the kid. Fan out and find them." Jake reached Thunder and quickly lifted the boy onto the horse's back, then swung up behind him. The child's small body pressed against Jake's chest, still shivering with cold and fear. "Hold on tight," Jake told him, wrapping one arm around the boy while taking Thunder's reins with the other hand. Gunshots exploded behind them as the outlaws began firing into the darkness, not sure of their target but hoping to get lucky. Bullets whined off the canyon walls and the sound echoed like thunder through the narrow passage. Thunder was a good horse, sure-footed and brave, but the rocky terrain made fast travel dangerous in the darkness. Jake had to balance speed against the risk of a fall that could injure or kill them both. Behind them, he could hear the outlaws shouting orders and cursing as they tried to organize pursuit. As Thunder carried them through the twisting passages of Devil's Canyon, Jake felt the boy relax slightly against him. For the first time in weeks, the child was moving away from his captors instead of deeper into danger. But Jake knew their escape was far from certain. The Garrett gang knew this country well, and they would be desperate to recapture their valuable prisoner. The first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky when Jake heard something that made him rein Thunder to a stop. Hoofbeats coming fast through the canyon behind them. The outlaws were mounted and in pursuit, and Jake could tell from the sound that they were gaining ground. In his arms, the boy looked up at Jake with those pale blue eyes and said something in Apache that Jake didn't understand. But the tone was clear enough. The child was asking if they were going to be caught. "Not if I can help it, son," Jake replied grimly, spurring Thunder forward again. "Not if I can help it." The chase through Devil's Canyon became a deadly game of cat and mouse as the morning light gradually revealed the stark landscape. Jake pushed Thunder as hard as he dared, but the narrow passages and loose rock made speed treacherous. Behind them, the Garrett gang was gaining ground, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls. The boy in Jake's arms had grown quiet, but Jake could feel the child's small body trembling with each gunshot that rang out behind them. The outlaws were firing wildly, hoping to bring down Thunder or force Jake to surrender. Bullets sparked off rocks and whined overhead, but the distance and poor light made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Jake's mind raced as he tried to remember the geography of the area. Devil's Canyon eventually opened onto a broad plateau where Thunder's speed advantage would be lost. Out in the open, the outlaws' superior numbers would make escape nearly impossible. Jake needed another option, and he needed it soon. As they rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, Jake saw something that gave him hope. A narrow side passage branched off to the left, barely wide enough for a horse and rider. Jake had noticed it on his way into the canyon, but hadn't paid it much attention. Now it might be their salvation. Without hesitation, Jake turned Thunder into the narrow passage. The walls pressed close on both sides, and in some places Jake had to duck to avoid overhanging rocks. The boy whimpered softly as branches scratched at them, but he held on tightly without complaint. The passage climbed steeply upward, winding through the rock formations like a hidden stairway. Thunder's breath came in short puffs as he struggled up the incline, but the sturdy horse never faltered. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as the outlaws lost the trail. After what seemed like hours of climbing, the passage opened onto a small mesa covered with scattered pine trees and boulders. Jake dismounted and lifted the boy down, both of them breathing hard from the tension and exertion. Thunder stood with his head down, sides heaving from the difficult climb. "Are we safe now?" the boy asked in English, his first words in the language since Jake had found him. "For now, son," Jake replied, surprised to hear the child switch languages.
"Can you tell me your name?"
The boy looked confused for a moment, as if the question was harder than it should be. "Tommy," he said finally. Tommy, he frowned with concentration. "I can't remember the rest." Jake knelt down to the boy's level, studying his face carefully. The trauma of losing his family and being kidnapped had clearly affected the child's memory. "That's all right, Tommy. Sometimes when bad things happen, we forget things for a while. It'll come back to you." Jake gave the boy some water from his canteen and a piece of hardtack to eat. Tommy ate hungrily, confirming Jake's suspicion that the outlaws had barely been feeding him. As the child ate, Jake studied their surroundings and planned their next move. The mesa provided good concealment, but it was also a potential trap. If the Garrett gang found the narrow passage, Jake and Tommy would be cornered with no escape route. Jake decided they needed to keep moving, but first he wanted to learn more about the boy. "Tommy, do you remember your family? Your mama and papa?" The boy's face clouded with sadness. "Mama and papa are sleeping. The bad men made them sleep and they won't wake up." His voice was matter-of-fact, the way children sometimes speak about things too terrible to fully understand. Jake's heart ached for the child. "I'm sorry about your mama and papa, Tommy. Do you remember where you lived before the bad men found you?" Tommy thought for a long moment. "We were going to California. Papa said we would have a big farm and horses. But first we lived with—" He paused, struggling with the memory. "With grandfather. He taught me words." "What kind of words, son?" Tommy replied in fluent Apache, the words flowing naturally despite his young age. Jake caught enough of the meaning to understand that Tommy was talking about learning to hunt and track from someone he called grandfather. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in Jake's mind. Tommy had lived with Apache people, probably for several years based on his fluency in the language. But he was clearly white, and he had been traveling with a wagon train when the Garrett gang attacked. Perhaps his family had been rescued from Apache captivity years ago, or maybe there was some other connection. Before Jake could ask more questions, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Voices coming from the direction they had fled. The Garrett gang had found the narrow passage and was following their trail. "Tommy, we have to go. Right now."
"Can you climb on Thunder by yourself?"
The boy nodded bravely and scrambled onto the horse's back with surprising agility. Jake mounted behind him and urged Thunder toward the far edge of the mesa. As they rode, Jake could see dust rising from the passage below, confirming that their pursuers were climbing toward them. The mesa's far side dropped away in a series of steep slopes and rocky terraces. It would be a dangerous descent, but staying on the mesa meant certain capture. Jake guided Thunder carefully down the treacherous path, letting the horse pick his own footing while keeping one arm wrapped securely around Tommy. Halfway down the slope, Jake heard shouts from above. The outlaws had reached the mesa and could see them descending. Gunshots rang out, but the distance and angle made accurate shooting difficult. Still, Jake pushed Thunder faster, knowing that every second counted. At the bottom of the slope, they found themselves in a different landscape entirely. Instead of desert canyon, they were now in higher country with scattered junipers and patches of grass. A small stream meandered through the area, providing water for Thunder and a chance to refill Jake's canteen. As Thunder drank, Jake studied Tommy more carefully. Despite everything the boy had endured, he showed a resilience that was remarkable. He sat quietly on the horse without complaining, and his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings with an alertness that seemed beyond his years. "Tommy," The Apache words, you know. Who taught them to you? Grandfather, Tommy said simply. He said I was his little warrior. He made me this. Tommy reached inside his torn shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch hanging from a cord around his neck. He said it would keep me safe. Jake examined the pouch briefly. It was Apache work, beautifully crafted with tiny beads and intricate stitching. Inside would be a medicine bundle, items considered sacred and protective by Apache people. For a white child to carry such a thing suggested a deep and meaningful relationship with Apache culture. Tommy was grandfather an Apache man? The boy nodded. He found me when I was little. He said the bad men took me from my first mama and papa, but he saved me. He taught me to be Apache, but then... Tommy's face scrunched with the effort of remembering. Then other white people came and said I had to go with them. They said grandfather couldn't keep me anymore. The picture was becoming clearer. Tommy had been kidnapped as a very young child, probably during an Apache raid. But instead of being harmed, he had been adopted and raised by an Apache elder. Years later, he had been rescued by white authorities and presumably reunited with relatives or placed with a family heading west. This explained Tommy's bilingual abilities and his comfort with Apache customs. It also explained why he seemed more mature and alert than most children his age. Apache culture emphasized skills like observation, quiet movement, and awareness of surroundings from an early age. Jake's thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of horses. The Garrett gang was still pursuing them, and they were running out of places to hide. Jake needed help, and he needed it soon. As if in answer to his prayer, Jake heard a sound that made him look up sharply. Apache drums, the same rhythmic beating he had heard in the canyon the night before. But this time they were closer, coming from somewhere ahead of them in the higher country. Tommy heard the drums too, and his face lit up with the first genuine smile Jake had seen from him. The boy said something in rapid Apache that Jake didn't understand, but the tone was joyful and excited. "What is it, son?" "It's grandfather," Tommy whispered, his eyes shining with hope. "The drums are calling. Grandfather is coming to find me." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. If there were Apache warriors nearby and if they were looking for Tommy, the situation was about to become much more complicated. Jake had to decide quickly whether Apache help was a blessing or another form of danger in this increasingly complex rescue mission. The drums grew louder as Jake urged Thunder up a rocky slope toward higher ground. Tommy sat straighter in the saddle, his whole demeanor changed by the sound. The frightened, traumatized child was being replaced by someone more confident and alert. He began speaking in Apache, his voice carrying across the landscape in what sounded like a response to the drums. Jake's experience with Apache people had taught him that drums were used for communication as well as ceremony. If Tommy was right about his grandfather being nearby, the boy might be signaling their location. This could be salvation or disaster depending on how the Apache viewed Jake's presence. As they crested a ridge, Jake saw them. A small band of Apache warriors sat on their horses about 200 yards away, silhouetted against the morning sky. There were 8 men, all armed and painted for war. At their center sat an older man whose bearing and position marked him as their leader. Even at this distance, Jake could see the man's white hair and the dignity with which he held himself. Tommy let out a cry of pure joy and began waving his arms. "Grandfather! Grandfather!" he called in Apache, his young voice carrying clearly across the distance. The elderly Apache leader urged his horse forward, and Jake made a decision that could mean life or death for both him and Tommy. Instead of running, he rode slowly toward the Apache band with his hands clearly visible and his weapons untouched. As they drew closer, Jake could see the leader more clearly. The old man had a face like carved stone, weathered by decades under the desert sun. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. War paint streaked his cheeks, but his expression was not hostile as he looked at Tommy with unmistakable love and relief. Tommy was practically bouncing in the saddle with excitement. When they were within 20 feet of the Apache leader, the old man spoke in a voice like distant thunder. "You have brought him back to me, white man. I am in your debt." Jake was surprised to hear clear English from the Apache elder. "You must be grandfather," Jake said, bringing Thunder to a stop. "Tommy's been asking for you." The old man's eyes never left Tommy's face as he responded. "I am called Joseph White Eagle by your people. This child is my heart walking outside my body. When the white soldiers took him from our camp 3 moons ago, I thought I would never see him again." Tommy slipped down from Thunder's back and ran to White Eagle, who leaned down and lifted the boy onto his own horse. The reunion was touching to witness. Grandfather and grandson speaking rapidly in Apache while tears ran down both their faces. Jake watched the emotional scene while keeping part of his attention on the other Apache warriors. They sat quietly on their horses, weapons ready but not threatening, waiting for their leader's direction. Jake could hear distant gunshots from behind them, reminding him that the Garrett gang was still in pursuit. White Eagle seemed to hear the shots too. His expression hardened as he looked back toward the lower country. The men who stole him? The Garrett gang. 4 of them, all armed and dangerous. They were planning to sell Tommy to slavers in Mexico. The old Apache's eyes flashed with anger. Bill Garrett. I know this name. He has taken Apache children before and white children too. He is a disease that spreads wherever he goes. One of the younger warriors spoke urgently to White Eagle in Apache, pointing back down the slope. Jake turned to see dust clouds rising from the direction they had come. The outlaws were closer than he had hoped. White Eagle spoke quickly to his warriors, giving orders that sent them spreading out across the ridge in tactical positions. Jake realized he was about to witness Apache warfare at close range, and he wasn't sure whether he should be relieved or terrified. You will stay with the boy, White Eagle told Jake. My warriors will speak to these men who steal children. I want to help, Jake said. They're my responsibility too. The Apache leader studied Jake with those penetrating eyes. You risked your life for a child you did not know. You brought him through the desert to safety. You have done enough, Cowboy, but... He paused, seeming to consider. If you wish to see justice done, you may watch from here. Jake dismounted and stood beside Tommy, who was now wrapped in a colorful blanket one of the warriors had given him. The boy looked happier than Jake had seen him, chattering excitedly in Apache while keeping one small hand firmly gripped in his grandfather's. The wait was not long. Within minutes, the Garrett gang came thundering up the slope, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with determination. They were so focused on the chase that they didn't notice the Apache warriors positioned among the rocks until it was too late. White Eagle's voice rang out across the ridge, speaking in clear English so the outlaws would understand. Bill Garrett, you have stolen your last child. The effect was electric. The 4 outlaws hauled back on their reins, their horses skidding and fighting for balance on the loose rock. Bill Garrett's scarred face went pale as he realized they were surrounded by Apache warriors whose rifles were all pointed at them. Apache, Tom Garrett shouted. Bill, we rode into a trap! Bill Garrett was a killer and a coward, but he was also cunning. His eyes darted around the ridge, calculating odds and looking for escape routes. What do you want, old man? The boy belongs to us. We found him first. White Eagle's laugh was without humor. You found him? The way a coyote finds a lamb? This child is my grandson. Stolen from me by white soldiers who said they knew better than Apache people how to raise Apache children. You stole him from people who stole him from me. Jake watched the scene unfold with fascination. He was witnessing something rare. Apache justice being dispensed according to Apache law. The warriors remained perfectly still, their weapons trained on the outlaws waiting for their leader's word. Now you have a choice, Bill Garrett, White Eagle continued. You can surrender your weapons and be taken to the white man's law, or you can try to fight your way out and die on this ridge. Choose quickly. Snake Morrison, his hands still bound from Jake's capture, spoke up desperately. Bill, we can't fight them all. There's too many. But Bill Garrett was too proud and too stupid to surrender. Jake saw the decision in the outlaw's eyes a split second before Garrett went for his gun. Tom, break left and run for it. The gunfight lasted less than 10 seconds. The Apache warriors had positioned themselves perfectly, with overlapping fields of fire and clear escape routes. Bill Garrett managed to clear leather with his pistol, before 3 Apache bullets ended his criminal career permanently. Tom Garrett got his gun half drawn before joining his brother in death. Snake Morrison and the 4th outlaw, a man named Pete Collins, threw their hands up and shouted surrender. The Apache warriors emerged from their concealment like ghosts materializing from the rocks, quickly disarming the surviving outlaws and securing them with rawhide rope. White Eagle rode over to where Jake stood with Tommy. The boy had watched the entire confrontation without flinching, his Apache training having prepared him for the realities of frontier justice. It is finished, the old man said simply. These men will be taken to the white authorities in Tucson. They will answer for their crimes according to white man's law. Jake nodded, impressed by the precision and restraint the Apache warriors had shown. They could have killed all 4 outlaws easily, but they had chosen to capture the survivors for proper legal justice. "What about Tommy?" Jake asked. "What happens to him now?" White Eagle's weathered face softened as he looked at his grandson. "That is not for me to decide alone. The boy has been living in both worlds, Apache and white. He must choose for himself which path he will follow." Tommy looked up at his grandfather, then at Jake, his young face serious with the weight of decision. When he spoke, it was in English, but with the careful cadence of someone translating thoughts from another language. "Grandfather, I want to stay with you, but the white people will come and take me away again, won't they?" White Eagle was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with thought. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but perhaps not. The world is changing, little warrior. There may be a way for you to walk in both worlds without losing either one." Jake found himself thinking about the toy horse still tucked in his saddlebags, and about the loving craftsmanship that had gone into making it. Someone had cared enough about this boy to spend hours creating something beautiful for him. The question now was how to honor that love, while also honoring the bonds that tied Tommy to his Apache family. The journey back to the trading post took 2 days, with Jake riding alongside the Apache band as they escorted their prisoners toward justice. Tommy rode with his grandfather, chattering constantly in Apache and English, clearly happy to be reunited with the man who had raised him. Jake found himself studying the relationship between the old Apache leader and the boy, seeing a bond that went far deeper than blood. During their evening camp on the first night, White Eagle shared more of Tommy's story with Jake. The boy had indeed been kidnapped during an Apache raid when he was barely 3 years old. But instead of being harmed, he had been adopted by White Eagle's daughter, who had lost her own son to disease. When the daughter died 2 years later, White Eagle had taken over raising the boy as his own grandson. "In our way, he became truly Apache," White Eagle explained as they sat by the fire, "not because of his blood, but because of his heart. He learned our language, our customs, our relationship with the land. He was not a captive, but a beloved son." Jake watched Tommy playing a traditional Apache game with some of the younger warriors, his laughter ringing across the camp. "But the soldiers came for him?" White Eagle's face darkened. 3 months ago, they said all white children must be returned to white families. They would not listen when I explained that he was happy, that he was loved, that he belonged with us. They took him at gunpoint and gave him to a missionary family heading to California. The pieces finally clicked into place for Jake. "The wagon train that was attacked? Yes, the missionary and his wife were kind people, according to Tommy. They did not try to make him forget his Apache life, but they could not protect him when the Garrett gang attacked. Tommy says he tried to hide, but the outlaws found him and thought he would be valuable because he was white." Jake pulled the wooden toy horse from his saddlebags and handed it to White Eagle. "Tommy dropped this when they took him. Do you know who made it?" The old Apache examined the carving carefully, his weathered fingers tracing the intricate details. A sad smile crossed his face. "This is the work of Brother Samuel, the missionary. He was a carpenter before he became a man of God. He made this for Tommy to help the boy remember that not all white men were enemies." White Eagle passed the toy to Tommy, who had approached the fire drawn by their conversation. The boy's face lit up as he saw the wooden horse. "Papa Samuel made this for me," Tommy exclaimed in English. "He said every boy needs a horse, even if it's just made of wood. He was teaching me to carve too before—" His voice trailed off as he remembered what had happened to his adoptive family. Jake felt a deep sadness for all the loss this child had experienced. Parents killed, beloved grandfather separated from him by force, and then his new family murdered by outlaws. Yet Tommy seemed resilient, perhaps because his Apache upbringing had taught him that loss and hardship were part of life's natural cycle. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to their camp. Jake woke to the sound of horses approaching and emerged from his bedroll to see a small cavalry patrol riding toward them. The sight of uniformed soldiers made the Apache warriors tense, hands moving instinctively toward weapons. But White Eagle remained calm, rising to meet the soldiers with dignity and tact. The patrol was led by a young lieutenant who looked nervous about encountering armed Apache in the field. His eyes darted between the warriors and the bound prisoners, clearly trying to understand the situation. "I'm Lieutenant Morrison, 3rd Cavalry," the officer announced. We're investigating reports of gunfire and missing persons in this area. I am Joseph White Eagle, the old Apache replied formally. We are escorting prisoners to the authorities in Tucson. These men kidnapped a child and murdered a family of missionaries. Jake stepped forward, realizing his presence might help legitimize the situation. Lieutenant, I'm Jake Morrison, working for the R Ranch. These Apache men helped me rescue a kidnapped boy and capture the Garrett gang. Bill and Tom Garrett are dead, but Snake Morrison and Pete Collins are alive for trial. The lieutenant's expression changed when he heard the Garrett name. The Garrett gang? We've been hunting them for months. They're wanted for murder and robbery in 3 territories. White Eagle gestured toward Tommy, who stood close to his grandfather but watched the soldiers with wary eyes. The boy they stole is here. He is safe now. Lieutenant Morrison looked at Tommy with curiosity. Son, what's your name? Are you hurt? Tommy glanced at his grandfather, then replied in careful English. I am Tommy. The bad men took me, but Grandfather and the Cowboy saved me. Grandfather? The lieutenant looked confused. But you're white. Blood does not make family, Lieutenant, White Eagle said with quiet dignity. Love makes family. This boy is my grandson in all ways that matter. Jake could see the conflict in the young officer's face. Military regulations probably required him to take custody of any white child found among Apache, regardless of circumstances. But the situation was clearly more complex than his training had prepared him for. Lieutenant, Jake said carefully, this boy has been through terrible trauma. He's lost 2 families to violence. Maybe the most important thing right now is making sure he's safe and cared for, rather than following strict regulations. Before the lieutenant could respond, Tommy stepped forward and spoke with a maturity that belied his young age. I know I look white, but I am Apache in my heart. Grandfather taught me to be strong, to respect all living things, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. But I also learned from Papa Samuel and Mama Ruth that white people can be good too. I want to honor both families who loved me. The boy paused, looking around at all the adults whose decisions would shape his future. Can't I be both, Apache and white? Why do I have to choose only one? White Eagle placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. You speak wisdom, little warrior. The world is changing. Perhaps it is time for all of us to find new ways to live together. Lieutenant Morrison struggled with his decision for several minutes, consulting with his sergeant and studying the unusual group before him. Finally, he seemed to reach a conclusion. I'm going to recommend to my commander that this boy remain in the custody of his Apache grandfather pending a full investigation, he said formally. Given the circumstances and the obvious bond between them, it seems to be in the child's best interest. Jake felt relief wash over him. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it bought time for a better arrangement to be worked out. The lieutenant continued, However, I'll need Mr. Morrison here to provide a full report on the kidnapping and rescue, along with testimony about the boy's treatment and apparent well-being with his Apache family. Jake nodded agreement. I'll be happy to provide whatever testimony you need. Lieutenant, as the cavalry patrol prepared to escort the prisoners to Tucson, White Eagle approached Jake with formal dignity. You have done a great service, not just for Tommy but for justice itself. In Apache tradition, this creates a bond between us. You will always be welcome in our camp, and if you ever need help, you have only to ask. Jake was moved by the old man's words. I just did what any decent person would do. No, White Eagle replied firmly. You did what a person with honor does. There is a difference. Tommy ran over to Jake and wrapped his small arms around the cowboy's waist. Will I see you again? He asked in English. Jake knelt down to the boy's level. I hope so, son. You're a brave kid and you're going to grow up to be a good man no matter which world you choose to live in. I choose both, Tommy said with conviction. Grandfather says the future belongs to people who can walk in both worlds. As Jake mounted Thunder to return to his duties at the R Ranch, he reflected on the strange events of the past few days. He had started out tracking cattle rustlers and ended up witnessing something much more important. The possibility that people from different cultures could find ways to respect and care for each other despite their differences. The Apache woman Maria had been right when she said the boy's situation was important, in ways Jake would understand when he saw him. Tommy represented something new on the frontier, a bridge between 2 worlds, raised with love by people who saw past the color of his skin to the content of his character. As Jake rode away from the camp, he could hear Tommy's laughter mixing with the voices of Apache children as they played together. The sound carried hope across the desert, a promise that the future might hold more understanding and less violence than the past. The wooden toy horse rode safely in Jake's saddlebags, waiting to be returned to Tommy when the boy was ready to remember Papa Samuel's kindness, along with grandfather's wisdom. In a world where people were often forced to choose between cultures, Tommy was proof that love could build bridges strong enough to span any divide. Jake Morrison had rescued more than a kidnapped child. He had helped preserve the possibility that different peoples could share the same land in peace, raising their children with respect for all traditions that taught love, courage, and honor. It was a lesson the frontier desperately needed to learn,